Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ian Culbert. I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Public Health Association, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's webinar, COVID-19 Vaccine Development and Update. We have some tremendous speakers lined up to speak with you today, and a lot of information to cover, so we will not tarry one moment. I want to begin by acknowledging that while we are coming together from all across Turtle Island today, that the Canadian Public Health Association's office is located on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. As we talk about the development of COVID vaccine and its implementation and distribution across the country, I think we need to be particularly aware of the needs of Indigenous communities across the country to be included in our conversations so that we can make sure that our efforts to get a vaccine to their communities, to their peoples, are inclusive, that are welcomed, and that are in a format that's acceptable to them. There is a tradition of distrust of governments and public health officials amongst Indigenous peoples. And so we need to build bridges so that that trust can be rebuilt in this, at this time of coming together. I want to acknowledge that the webinar today is being hosted by CPHA through an unrestricted educational grant from Medicago. And while we very much appreciate the support from Medicago, we want to acknowledge that Medicago has not had input into the content of this material and that the editorial control is rested in CPHA. Obviously, this is a Zoom webinar, and I think by now in the pandemic, everyone knows everything about Zoom, but I just wanted to let you know that all participants' microphones are muted. If you want to ask a question, please use the Q&A feature. If you want to have a conversation with your colleagues, you can do that using chat, but we'll only be focusing on our attention on the Q&A chat box, or the Q&A box for questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to CPHA's YouTube channel shortly after this session is complete. And if you are a Twitter fan, a follower, account holder, please use the hashtag COVID-19 VaxUpdate. So without further ado, just want to acknowledge our tremendous faculty that we have with us today. Today's session will be moderated by Dr. Bonnie Henry, the Provincial Health Officer for British Columbia. And our speakers include Marianne Stanford, who is Vice President of Research and Development at IMV Inc., as well as being an adjunct professor at Dalhousie University. Gary Kobinger is the Director of Infectious Disease Research Center at Université Laval. And Brian Ward is Professor at McGill University in Montreal, as well as a Medical Officer for Medicago. Each of our panelists have provided disclosure that you see on the screen before you. And as we've discussed previously, or included in our promotion material, we have a number of objectives for today's session. Certainly at the end of the session, you'll be redirected to a very short evaluation survey, and we hope that you'll take about 1 minute to complete that survey so that we can get your feedback on this session and plans for future sessions. Very briefly, the session for the agenda for today. I'm almost finished, that's the good news, and then we'll turn it over to Bonnie, and then we'll have a conversation amongst the rest of our panelists. And we've left 25 minutes for Q&A towards the end, and we can take that as long as we need to. So looking forward to an exciting and informative webinar with everyone today. So with that, I will turn it over to Bonnie. Bonnie.
Thank you, Ian, and thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. I volunteered after Ian asked me to chair this panel so that I could learn about the latest that is happening with vaccines here in Canada and around the world, and I know we'll all get some really important and useful information for us as this pandemic progresses here in Canada. I want to start by saying that I'm coming to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Lekwungen speaking people here in Victoria, BC, and that's the Esquimalt and the Songhees First Nation, who are the traditional keepers of the land here. And I'm very grateful to be able to speak to you from these lands today. I'm going to give just a little bit, very short update where we are with this pandemic, and then turn it over to our panelists to give us their perspectives around a number of different issues, and then we'll take some questions, because I think that's going to be the most important part for us all. So next slide. It's hard to believe that really the last, well, now 10 months, but really we've only learned about this virus starting in December. It maybe was circulating in China prior to that, but I know for me, the alerts really came as we were looking towards the new year in January. And my post-SARS in Toronto anxiety started acting up quite heavily early in January, when we started to hear reports of atypical pneumonias in China. And as I know, I don't need to say, the challenges that we have seen as this pandemic has spread globally have been things that many of us have been working on for many years in terms of pandemic plan preparedness. We had learned from SARS, we had learned from the influenza pandemic we had in 2009. But I don't know that any of us actually felt that we would be in the position that we are in now. Having said that, the most important things that we can think about to help us manage as we move forward are being able to have a vaccine that effectively protects, particularly those who are most vulnerable. This is a timeline, as you can see, with all of the major events that happened. I know here in Canada, we were not surprised given the travel patterns that we had seen for cases to be seen here. And they were early late in January and then into February. And then, of course, the pandemic was declared on March 11th. On the next slide. This is something that we've become used to seeing. It is the worldwide cases of confirmed cases of COVID-19. And as we know, this is an underrepresentation of people who've actually been affected and infected. And that is something that has been a challenge for all of us. We were leap years ahead in the fact that we had a test that was able to tell us whether people had this virus quite early on, but the ability to ramp up the testing and to have it more widespread and available in many places has been a challenge that we all know. And though it started in, this is the WHO regions in China, as we know, right now, the Americas is a huge area of concern. We've seen dramatic increases in cases, and in our country to the south of us, of course, we know that it has been increasing and decreasing in different areas across the country. And that is one of the things that challenges us when this virus is anywhere. We've come to learn the risk is everywhere. If we look at the next slide, this is the COVID-19 cases in Canada, and it's colored by age group. I think this is also really important. Early on, we recognized that it was older people, particularly in our long-term care homes, who were more vulnerable to both acquiring this illness and having severe illness and coming into hospital or dying. And we can see that in the first phase of our pandemic here in Canada, that it was heavily represented by people, by older people. We now have seen a shift in the demographics, and this is something that we've all been monitoring and watching, where a lot more younger people have been infected in the past 2 months, particularly over the summer and into September, where we're seeing the 20 to 39-year-old age group predominate. The good thing about that is that it means that fewer people are ending up in hospital or dying from this, but it is still a challenge because we do not know the long-term impacts of this virus on people's health. And we know that for some people, recovery is a challenge, and we don't know how long it's going to be for people to recover from this virus. And the next slide. This is a snapshot of where we are in cases by province as of the end of last week, so September 23rd. And I know many of us have heard over the weekend, things have dramatically increased in a number of provinces, particularly Ontario, Quebec, Manitoba. Here in BC, we've also seen an increase, although we've leveled off a little bit in the last few days. Although, you know, so much is dependent. We do know what we need to do to stop this virus, but we are now in that very difficult position in public health of trying to find that balance between the wellness of our community, which means children going to school, people going to work, and our economy, and the downside impacts of closing those down with controlling this virus, ensuring that we're not overwhelming our healthcare system, because we know when that happens, that people suffer across our community. And next slide. This is the last that I'll present just to give people a perspective of where we are. We know that older people are more likely to be hospitalized. The median age is around the 60s to be hospitalized. But people in ICU and people who die are overwhelmingly in their 70s, 80s, and older. And that is something that we need to take into account when we think about vaccines, because we want to make sure that we can protect essential workers, like healthcare workers and others, but we also are looking to how can we best protect those who are more likely to end up in hospital or to die from this very pernicious virus. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to turn it over next to Gary, who is going to talk to us about the vaccine development update. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you. This was very helpful and great slides. I'm going to go quickly over a few slides on where we stand in terms of vaccine development worldwide. It's a field, as you can imagine, that is moving extremely fast. And thus it's almost changing daily, and there's a lot of discussion at all levels of vaccine development. I will start by saying this: we have never seen in the history of vaccination, as far as I know, so much effort and so much work being done every day to move all these vaccines forward and try to find more than one that would be safe and efficacious to protect against SARS-CoV-2 and thus COVID-19. On the next slides, please. So this slide is just again showing you the very high number of vaccines that are being evaluated. We are over 170 vaccine or vaccine regimen in different stages. You can see on the left that many of them are still in preclinical stages. And 38 of which are now in clinical studies. So from phase 1, 2, 3 phases. And just to remind people very quickly, phase 1 is usually a clinical trial that is in around 50 or less people. Sometimes it can be more, even 200. The first goal is to assess safety of the vaccine and usually accumulate data on immunogenicity. Phase 2 is an expanded phase 1, basically, again, focusing on safety and again, accumulating data on immunogenicity. Phase 3 is really where we start looking at protection in a meaningful way, again, focusing on safety first, accumulating data in this time a large population, often more than in the tens of thousands of people, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And of those vaccines right now, as you can see, there's already 9 that have advanced to phase 3, which is incredible considering that it's only 9 months. To give some perspective to this, normally to go from phase 1 to phase 3, it's easily 10 to 15 years of progression. And so here, what's being done is to try to compress 15 years into 1 year or less, or at least within 2 years, certainly. So you see all the different kind of vaccine that are being evaluated: VLP, replicating viral vectors, DNA, protein subunit, RNA, inactivated and non-replicating viral vectors. And you see the numbers that refers to the different phase of clinical progression. It's important, I think, to note that some of those strategy or technologies are using platform that have been used in the past that are associated with commercial vaccine that are being used for many years.
I'm just going to interrupt you for a sec, Gary, and ask you to let Ian ask Ian to advance the slides, because I think we're not on the same one that you're talking to. There we go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's good. Thank you for moving the slide. So you see on this slide the different technologies: RNA, DNA, inactivated vaccine, and of course the phone will start ringing immediately, but it's going to be stopped. So you see the different technologies, and again, what I think is important to remind people is that some of those technology are being used currently for different vaccines that are commercially used. Some are what we call new technologies, and actually a lot of those new technologies are advancing very rapidly. I don't want to go through all the plus and minuses of all the platforms. I think it's just to give you a snapshot, and it tells you one thing is nothing is perfect. And it is likely that some vaccine and vaccine strategy or vaccine regimen may be potentially more appropriate for some subpopulation. And this is actually one of the ways that where vaccine availability may be accelerated, because if you focus on a small indication, so let's say you go on an age group for a specific indication, a technology could be easier than another one. So next slide, please. And again, from the strategy in Canada, a different front. So first to see what is within Canada, and there's a lot of good, very good research, a lot of experimental vaccine advancing. But the major pharmaceutical company is Canada. And so the approach here was for Canada to enter into agreement and some contract with some of those companies to make sure that if they do have a vaccine that is advancing and to the end and found to be safe and efficacious, that the country can access and Canadian can access doses of those vaccines. So you see here the list for which Canada has agreement with. So Pfizer with RNA vaccine-based vaccine, Moderna with another RNA-based vaccine, or both of them in phase 3. There's Johnson & Johnson with an adenovirus-based, so non-replicating viral vectors. It's based on adenovirus, as I said, in phase 3. Novavax and Sanofi GSK are protein subunit, which is here the only technology that has been used for existing vaccine. It doesn't mean they're better or worse. It just means that there's 3 that are more new technology and 2 that are based on more established technology for which we have a commercial product. Thank you. Next slide. And thank you. And I will pass this on to Brian.
So thank you very much for the invitation to join this seminar. And I just want to reiterate the conflict of interest. I was assigned this task to talk about vaccine development in Canada, in part because my long interest in vaccines, but also because I serve as the medical officer for Medicago. So I have 1 foot firmly in academics and 1 foot in industry at the current time. Uncomfortable at times. Next slide, please. So where are we in Canada? Well, there are, and this is probably an incomplete list because there are many other vaccines that are being developed by small groups, but this just gives you an idea of the range of vaccines that are being developed with different forms of support, some public, some private, and some combined in Canada. At the current time, Medicago is the only Canadian vaccine that is produced on Canadian soil that is in the clinical phase. And in fact, we have just completed our phase 1 study, and we're not sleeping very much these days because we're preparing to move to our phase 2/3 study in the coming weeks. We'll be releasing the data from the non-human primate and the phase 1 study in the next couple of weeks. But we're not alone, and it's really important that, in fact, many of these vaccines succeed. Because we have 36, 37 million people in Canada, but in fact, the whole world is going to need a dose of vaccine, and almost all vaccines are being tested, need 2 doses. So when large companies say they have the capacity to make 1 billion doses in a year, we're probably going to need something on the order of 15.6 billion doses to protect the world. So there's every reason to hope that many of these Canadian vaccines that are currently in preclinical will actually catch up quickly and prove to be safe and effective. So for example, the University of Manitoba developed a virus-like particle vaccine, Western Ontario, a replicating viral vector, University of Alberta, and Vito, peptide and protein vaccines, and IMV, out in the Maritimes, is producing a peptide epitope vaccine. So this Canadian activity is a pretty good reflection of what's happening across the world. As Gary said, many of these technologies are new and largely untried. That doesn't mean they'll be bad, it just means that we don't have a great deal of experience with them. Next slide, please. I'm just going to highlight 3 of the vaccines that are likely to move into clinical trials relatively soon. IMV out in Maritimes, it's a spike peptide with a no-release lipid-based delivery system. They have quite a bit of interesting data for cancer vaccines, immunotherapy, and a candidate RSV vaccine. This vaccine platform elicits really good antibodies and T cells. And we know with the highly pathogenic coronaviruses that the T cells are probably really important for long-term immunity. Antibodies can protect, but you want both antibodies and T cells if you can. CanSino Bio, again, targeting the spike protein. I won't repeat myself because almost all of the vaccines target the spike protein. It's a human adenovirus 5 vector, very much like some of the other vaccines being developed. It also has a track record. This platform has a track record with some vaccines for emerging pathogens. This vaccine can also elicit antibodies and T cells, and they're currently in clinical, but not in Canada. They're in phase 3 in a number of countries. They were supposed to come to Canada, but as you can see, political interference got in the way, and that vaccine will not be tested in Canada, at least not for the foreseeable future. Finally, Vito Intervac has an interesting spike protein subunit vaccine, which is combined with their so-called triple adjuvant that targets several different aspects of the innate immune response. It's been tried in animal models, and it's a very effective vaccine, again, eliciting antibodies and T cells. And it's also in preclinical with very good results in several of the animal models they've tried. So we will hope that at least these 3 move on to clinical trials in Canada in the very near future. And the last 2 slides will just give you an update on where Medicago is. If you could go quickly, Ian, just through the next few slides to the end. This is one of those lovely animated diagrams, but it basically gives you an idea of what the platform is. For those of you who are not familiar with the process, Medicago is a recombinant platform, a transient expression of the gene of interest in the plant. So we start with the DNA of interest. We then put that DNA into the plant leaves using a process called agroinfiltration delivered by an attenuated bacterium. We then take the plants out, put them in the sun, let them grow for a few days, harvest the leaves, and then extract the virus-like particles from the leaves. We started to work on this vaccine within days of the DNA sequence of the new virus being published from China. And in fact, This is the virus-like particle that we saw on electron microscopy very shortly after, and we've been developing the processes to make this virus-like particle vaccine at very large numbers in both Canada and the United States. Next slide and last slide. Here's our clinical development plan, and you can see in the middle is that horrible month of October, where we have our phase 1 study coming down. We have a large non-human primate study that's also finished. We're compiling those data, and those data, I would have to kill you if I told you what they were, but they are promising, and we're smiling at Medicago even though we need some sleep. We are starting the phase 2/3 study in the next couple of weeks. The phase 2 study will recruit just under 500 individuals to test our vaccine. We've chosen the dose and the adjuvant. The adjuvant has not actually been released publicly yet, but it is an adjuvanted plant-made virus-like particle vaccine that will proceed into the phase 2 study. If our dose and adjuvant selection are confirmed and it's safe and immunogenic in those just under 500 people, we will move very rapidly to a study of at least 30,000 people in Canada, the United States, and several other countries. So in fact, our phase 2 study will target 4 populations: kids 5 to 17 years of age, adults 18 to 64, older adults, and adults with comorbidities. We have the capacity to produce probably 10 to 20 million doses a year in Canada, and between 100 and 200 million doses a year in our facility in North Carolina. So we're very hopeful that if our vaccine proves to be successful in the next several months, that we will be able to contribute in our small way to resolving this problem, both in Canada and in the world. And I think we'll pass to the next slide and hand it off to Marianne.
Thank you, Brian. So as a vaccine researcher, I'm going to step a little bit outside my area of expertise to present a couple of slides around vaccine acceptability and the potential rollout in Canada. I think there are really 3 things that we need to address going forward, assuming that we will have in our hands vaccine candidates. The first one is addressing vaccine hesitancy, especially in the light of the rapid vaccine development that both Brian and Gary spoke about. And that really has to do with the public's perception of the safety and acceptability of a vaccine once approved, and really the knowledge gaps that might exist, real or imagined or belief in the public. The second is really the capacity for the biomanufacturing as well as the distribution across Canada. So it really is about how do we secure the right number of doses to immunize our population. And assuming we can address the first 2, how do we prioritize the groups to receive a vaccine? We really want to minimize the serious illness and overall deaths, including from other causes to COVID-19. And we really want to minimize the disruption, the idea of a quote unquote return to normal, and how do we then transition in a post-vaccine public, and how do we reduce the burden to healthcare resources? So the next slide. So what is the current public appetite for a vaccine to COVID? And this is a snapshot of public perception based on an Angus Reid poll taken in early August. And when they were asked if there was a vaccine to coronavirus available to you, would you get vaccinated? At that time, about 46% of those polled said that they would take a vaccine immediately, whereas an additional about 30% said that they would be vaccinated, but they would want to wait first. And when probed about why they would want to wait, the potential for side effects remained a significant concern in about 76% of those who would want to wait, whereas those who were eager to be vaccinated first, only 37 of those said that side effects were a major concern to them. When people were asked about general how people should be vaccinated, about 75% said that those who worked in long-term care facilities or healthcare workers should be vaccinated. And about 63% said that those who worked in schools should take the vaccine. And although this is not sort of the universal uptake that most people hope for, there is a recognition across Canada that if we want to go back to our new version of normal, that vaccination will be a key component to that. and that was slightly different between rural and urban residents. Next slide, please. So the manufacturing and distribution at a large scale still remains to be a challenge in Canada. We do have, these are just some of the challenges that our country faces in rolling out new vaccines, especially ones made at home. These are just some of the things that were identified as challenges. One of them is long-term pandemic preparedness. And I think in light of this pandemic, this is something that Canada, we hope will learn and prioritize. We lack a lot of the facilities we need across the country to study pandemic viruses. Really addressing pandemics with platform technologies, as Brian said and Gary said, a lot of the technologies that are moving quickly are based on platforms that have long clinical expertise, and really to be prepared for pandemics with a made in Canada solution, we really need to prioritize studying these platforms. We also need to be prepared for long-term manufacturing within our borders. I think you've seen the government attempt to address this, the gap we currently have in biomanufacturing, so that we have the capacity to make these vaccines within our country and not remain dependent on the global market. And so you've seen that throughout the talk, we've looked at some of the technologies that Canada is addressing through contracts, as well as supporting internal. And right now, we're really trying to maintain that balance so that vaccines will be available to Canadians. Next slide. So assuming that vaccines are ready to roll out, how they will be rolled out still remains a little bit of a black box. The government has not yet provided a rollout plan, but we can get some idea of what that might look like based on the National Advisory Committee on Immunization documents around both early and late stage clinical trial for COVID-19 vaccine candidates. I'll go over some of the things that they have put out to date. In the early phase trials, the primary priority populations, and this is really to look at vaccine safety, immunogenicity, and efficacy, have been adults without underlying conditions, as well as older adults, which have been hit particularly hard by COVID-19 with and without underlying conditions. And then the secondary populations have included those with underlying health conditions, immunocompromised children and adolescents, as well as pregnant women. You go to the next slide. When we get into the advanced clinical development, the priority populations are slightly different. And I think this might be a little bit more close to what we might see during rollout. And that is looking at older adults with one or more of the comorbidities that have been associated with COVID-19, those older adults with those existing comorbidities, children and adolescents who have comorbidities that may make them more susceptible to COVID-19, as well as individuals who work or have significant exposure as a part of their work. So this would be healthcare workers and emergency workers, or those with a high degree of social contact, and potentially travelers. And that was my last slide. And thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And I will just add to what Dr. Stanford had just talked about, in that the National Advisory Committee on Immunization in Canada has been working on how we would roll out vaccines. As you can imagine from what we've just heard, it's a very challenging prospect, because we don't know which vaccines will be effective, and we also don't know if some vaccines will work better in certain populations. So those are some of the challenges that we're trying to work through with public health leadership, as well as NACI. So we do have a number of panel questions that we've talked about that we'll start with, and then I've been monitoring the Q&A, and we'll take some of those questions as we move on as well. And I'd like to start by asking our panelists, so how has pandemic preparedness changed in light of COVID-19, and what are the key gaps that still need to be addressed? We've seen some of that, but maybe I'll start with you, Brian. Is there any additional issues that you think have changed that we've learned. Oh, and you have to take yourself off mute. It wouldn't be a Zoom call if we didn't forget to take ourselves off mute.
At least once, yeah. I mean, it's hard to say thank you to viruses, but I think we are far better prepared today than we were 20 years ago. And we actually have SARS-1 and the pandemic influenza virus of 09-10 to thank for that. I think there's been a mobilization of public health expertise and resources over the last 20 years to try to be better prepared. And some of the very concrete consequences of that greater attention to pandemics or the potential for pandemics has been the creation of networks, for example, the Canadian Immunization Research Network and other public health networks that are focused on addressing pandemics. I know that Gary has been very involved internationally with trying to extend Canada's influence more broadly so that we don't think in terms of pandemic nationalism, that we actually think more globally than locally, and maybe pass it to Gary.
Yeah, and I would ask you, Gary, about that. You know, what is Canada's role in making a vaccine available to populations at risk around the world? And I know some of the people have asked that on our the Q&A as well. And, you know, what should we be doing and what are we doing to combat, as you call it, Brian, vaccine nationalism?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, we have seen that Canada is contributing to the global effort to provide and make sure that the vaccine doses that are going to be made available, we all hope will be also distributed to a region of the world that may not have everything in place to be an active participant of producing those vaccines. I've seen one of the question in the Q&A that I thought was interesting, a suggestion for every dollar that is spent in Canada for Canadian for vaccine should also be invested for the international deployment of vaccine. And I think these are great ideas. I think it's hard to say, should it be a 1-to-1? Should it be a different ratio? You know, we'll see as things evolve. But what's, I think, very important is that Canada is really at the table to discuss and make sure that if there is an open door to help in any way improving accessibility to the vaccine when they will be available, including to some subpopulation. You know, there will be priority population, we can expect that. And the question, and I think what more and more is coming out is not to wait that the country has completely coverage before helping others, but to really focus on this priority population on an equal footing. And we all know that infectious disease transmit, especially it's a respiratory pathogen, and that the problem at one location of the globe is a problem for everybody. And that if we want to really bring this down and control it better, and maybe eventually one day eradicate it, who knows, then we need to act at the global level and not just country per country. Otherwise, we will be restricted in our silo, which we know nowadays is not actually a way to really be efficient at any level, I think socially, economically, and all this. Thank you.
Thanks, and I absolutely echo that. We have seen that this virus knows no geographic boundaries, and the challenge of countries trying to keep things to themselves is one of the ones that we, I believe, as well need to combat. I'm going to change a little bit and maybe turn to you, Marianne, and ask you about things. We've got a lot of questions about correlates of protection, and would we expect a vaccine to prevent transmission from asymptomatic carriers? What about immunity? Can you start us off by talking about some of those issues?
Sure, I can certainly start, and I'm sure Brian and Gary also have some opinions on that. I think we've often used the analogy of, flying an airplane while we're building it, and I think the correlates of protection is one of those areas in which we're really learning as we go. I think based on what we've known about seasonal coronaviruses and other ones, other members of the same family, we're assuming that neutralizing antibodies are going to be a key component. I think what we also understand is that the T cell response is also a very important component. Now, what the relative contribution will be, I think that's something we will learn from the clinical trials. I mean, we're still learning about the immunity induced by the natural infection. So those two things are actually happening in parallel, which I hate to use the word unprecedented, but it really is. It's something that we're learning as we go. I think what we will see with efficacy is we're really looking to prevent the most serious of infections first. Whether or not that will result in what we call sterilizing immunity, which is the ability to not become infected at all, may become less of an issue. If we can stop the worst of the illness and limit the spread, I think that's really our first goal. And that's why the vaccines may be iterative. We may have some vaccines that are really effective at stopping severe disease and then seek for sterilizing immunity another time, if it's possible.
Gary or Brian, did you want to add to that? Okay, Brian. That's strike two.
That's 2 times. Third time and I'm out. Yes, I would like to say antibodies are easy to measure. And that's one of the reasons why we all focus on antibody responses for vaccines. They're easy, they're cheap, and measuring cell-mediated immune responses is expensive, hard, and very difficult to standardize. So there's a very good reason to look at neutralizing antibodies. And there's pretty good evidence from animal models and humans that neutralizing antibodies can be helpful. On the other hand, these coronaviruses are probably like most other viruses where the effective long-term immunity is heavily biased towards cellular immune responses. And so certainly my scientific bias, as well as my bias as a member of Medicago, is that you really want your vaccine to do both. You want a vaccine that's going to elicit a good neutralizing antibody response, but you also want evidence of T-cell immunity. And many of the vaccines that are under current development should do that. But we'll see over the next while how long some of those neutralizing antibody responses last. So far, it looks like some of them, like after natural disease, are relatively weak and transient. But this will become much more obvious over the next 6 months, for good or ill.
And Gary, did you want to add to that? I mean, the other thing that we see is there's different delivery mechanisms, and there's been some talk out there about whether a nasal spray vaccine would have better sterilizing immunity than injectable vaccine.
Yeah, and you know, I will bring another angle, and the angle is this: the question of understanding parameters of the immune system that can predict protection following vaccination and natural exposure is extremely important. That being said, it's also important to not get too much entangled into this. And why I say that is there's vaccines that have been licensed without clear correlates of protection. A vaccine can be linked to safety and efficacy without knowing the detailed mechanism that is underlying that efficacy. And so what I'm saying with this is that as much as it's a very important question, it's important that one doesn't slow the other one down, and that they can advance even if we are doing our best to understand the immunity, that we don't slow down progression of a vaccine that is shown to be safe and efficacious. But listen, it's my field. So of course, as an academician, I find this fascinating as a subject of, and very important. But again, you know, including for the Ebola vaccine, it's only very late in the process that we started to really put our fingers on what can predict protection. As much as I will add this while I'm speaking is because we had this discussion this morning with WHO, as you know, it's important that vaccine, we all understand how vaccine could have a very positive impact and help control the spread and the number of, bring down the number of positive cases. In the meantime, it's important to not just sit and wait for a vaccine. There is a lot of public health measures that are in place that are working very well. We've seen countries that are controlling the numbers. So as much as we want this vaccine and we're working really hard to get many of them, it's again very important to not you just put our everything in this future and act today to protect others, that especially the one that are more susceptible to severe disease and death, actually. Thank you.
And thank you for that. I absolutely, as a public health physician, of course, I recognize the importance of that, particularly as we're heading into fall and we're starting to see increases in this country again. We need to go back to our basics. But I will, that's a nice segue to, without these correlates of protection absolutely known, how can we overcome doubts in vaccine efficacy and safety during an accelerated clinical trial program that we've talked about? How do we overcome that vaccine hesitancy, that concern that we've seen in what you've presented, Marianne, around safety when we do have a rapidly accelerating program? And I'll start with you again, Gary, and then we'll get some questions from Marianne and Brian as well, or some responses.
Listen, just very, very quickly going back a little bit on the previous, I wanted to add something is, because we at one point we were hearing about those cases that were second infection, very well documented. You know, there is about 10 in the world. There is more than 30 million infection the cases documented. So I think the take-home message of this is whether we understand exactly what are the predictors of protection. The one thing for sure is an exposure to this virus seems to be largely, for now, in the time frame, largely protective against a second exposure. So I think that's a very good sign for vaccine. Now to your question, listen, I know that I've talked to many regulators. They are working nonstop. They are not letting their guard down. They will not skip any of the safety step. They are facilitating the work, and actually this comes as a high cost for companies or any effort that is in the clinic. And the way it works is that you are basically preparing your phase 2. You're still in your phase 1, and same thing for the phase 3. So you need to multiply your resources needed by a factor of, I don't know, 10, 20. And it's a high risk effort. But at the same time, the regulators have been working around the clock and following all these clinical trials. And I personally have a very high trust in Health Canada, to tell the truth. And for me, there's no sign that the speed comes at the expense of safety. Absolutely not. And I will wait to see every piece of data before you know, I think anything against that will be speculation at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. And Marianne, did you want to add to that around safety with this accelerator program?
Yeah, I think Gary sort of nailed it on the head, that the regulations and the expectations haven't changed, that the speed really comes from the amount of effort that's being pulled into it. The dedication to rapid review and you know, Brian joked several times about not getting any sleep, but that's a reality, that it's coming from human capital, not necessarily cutting corners. And I think sometimes we associate rapid with somehow shoddy, but I don't think there's any indication that the science hasn't been very rigorous. And I expect that regulators around the world are not loosening their requirements. There's no indication that that's a part of it. There's a lot of risk that's being accepted by developers, but it's very challenging as developers who are intrinsically believed to be sort of conflicted in that. So I think there has to be sort of a global communication around how things are approved and the standards at which they're being approved at.
Anything to add, Brian?
Well, I think in many ways, this COVID experience is going to change how we do many things. We were watching a movie the other night and we saw the movie Queen, and there was a mosh pit. And the immediate reaction of everyone in the family who was watching it was, oh my God, what are they doing? Right? We have completely changed our way of being. It will be interesting actually to see how regulators deal with the post-COVID era when they demonstrated that they were able to approve vaccines in a 12-month period. Is it going to change for the long term where we no longer have an expectation that it takes a decade to get a vaccine through safe approval process. We'll see.
That's a really interesting question. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question of you, slightly different, and then we'll go and take some of the questions from the Q&A, although I've tried to incorporate some of these in. What are the biggest issues that we face in rollout of the vaccine? And I think about a little bit, one is that we're hearing that the cold storage is going to be an issue, that some of these vaccines need very cold, some of them need a little bit of cold, but different from what our usual is. And what are some of the things that we can, that we need to address in terms of being able to roll out vaccine in a large scale? And I'll start with you, Brian, given that you finished up the last one.
Well, so I think societal approval is a huge, communication is going to be one of the most important things. That will be easier with a highly effective and safe vaccine. So hopefully we will have several candidates that actually make those bars. I think the storage and handling issues will be resolved over the next 4 to 6 months because the companies that are making those vaccines, the RNA vaccines in particular that have those, initially had those really difficult storage conditions, they've been working around the clock to make those storage and shipping conditions better. And they've largely succeeded. So that they're now talking about -20 instead of -80. So I think that there are technical advances that are happening that are going to help the rollout. But the worst case scenario is having 5 excellent vaccines that nobody wants to take. And so I really think that the social scientists are going to have to play a large role in making the Canadian rollout and the global rollout work.
Did you want to add anything, Marianne?
Other than that, I agree 100%. I think vaccine hesitancy, and I know there are good Canadian scientists who are working on this, and great social science researchers who are studying this. And vaccine hesitancy is not the same thing as being quote unquote anti-vax. Often it's about information. It's about understanding the process. And I think it's everybody's responsibility to be good communicators and really communicate the science in an effective way, in ways that people understand. And it's sometimes difficult when there's so much data and so much information for people to digest, sometimes challenging to know what to believe and know what to understand. So I think all scientists and all people in public health are just getting to be better communicators. And I think that's a key component.
Absolutely. And this is one of the reasons we're having these discussions today. Gary, final word to you on that one.
Yeah, very, very quickly, I fully agree. Listen, I think I don't want to minimize the challenges, the technical challenges of the cold chain, but we have seen hundreds of thousands of people being vaccinated in the middle of the tropical forest in Africa with a vaccine that had to be kept at -60 or below, and it did happen. So I think we'll be up to the task. I will add this, of course I had to, is the communication, a clear communication comes with also transparency, and I think this is the best actually tool that we are given to explain people why it is said that these vaccines will be safe when they are safe, why they are safe, and why they are efficacious. So I do advocate for transparency to have that communication and that people can see everything and make their decision. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I'm now going to, I've taken some notes around some of the questions, some of which we've answered already, but there's a couple of sort of short snappers. What percentage of vaccines in phase 3 make it to the market in general? Anybody want to give us that one?
There's actually, I'll take this one just as a start. For traditional vaccine development, the lowest rate of failure is the phase 3 to licensure, but it is still actually only about 30%. So you can get all the way to phase 3 and only 1 in 3 of those vaccines will actually make it to commercial licensure. If you go back to earlier stages, you add up really quite significant barriers to going from phase 1 all the way to licensure. I think that we, with these new vaccines, with the new platforms, we have far less information to predict how many of them will succeed. And that's, I think, why Canadian government, like other governments, are hedging their bets by having advanced purchase orders for vaccines that have multiple different platforms.
And there was one question that was addressed to you, Brian, so I'll ask it already. Address the myth that it's a race. And I think part of this goes to, you know, the probability that vaccines will be safe and effective.
Yeah, I've been trying to make this point in every interview. We always want to make it into a better story, make it into a race. But even the largest companies are only talking about producing 1 billion doses of vaccine in a year. And if they need 2 doses of their vaccine, that's 500 million people. And so we all actually have to hope very much that many of these vaccines prove to be safe and effective if we want to address this issue globally in any kind of a reasonable time frame. And so I would love it if people stop talking about this being a race and winners and losers. Some very smart people have said exactly that. Bill Gates said it just last month. It's not that kind of a race. It's a cooperative effort to move forward.
Thank you, Ian. And I think that is so incredibly important. And you talked about, actually all of you talked about a little bit, how we have had a global cooperation in ways, from the most part. Obviously, there are some places that are the exceptions, but to accelerate both, you know, the development of laboratory tests, the sharing of genomes, the vaccine development in ways that we've not seen, and even some of the global trials for treatment for this virus. So what would be nice is to see how this is going to affect our ability to develop vaccines in the future. So then, Marianne, another question was around vaccine acceptance again, and I know that's because you presented that despite being a researcher, but these are important. Do we have any data that you're aware of around vaccine acceptance by age? And do you know of, I'm combining a few questions here, do you know of any of the studies that are looking at some of the higher risk populations, in particular pregnant women, if they've been included?
So I don't know of any studies that can specifically look at vaccine hesitancy by age, but my understanding of the literature is that it typically, because vaccines are something that are delivered in childhood, you get a lot of vaccine hesitancy targeted towards parents, so parents of young children, because they're often making those decisions for children. I think my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brian or Gary, that those with immunocompromise or a lot of comorbidities actually have fairly good vaccine uptake because they understand the personal risk to being infected. I think sometimes where people have more of a challenge in assessing risk is when it's not just a personal risk, but a risk to their community and to their loved ones. And I think, you know, risk management in itself plays into vaccine hesitancy, as does, you know, a lot of things in our social media world, I think, factor in, although vaccine hesitancy is certainly not a new concept. It's been around as long as vaccines have been around.
Absolutely. All right, and I'll ask you, Gary, another question about, people have asked about 1 or 2 doses. What would the spacing likely be? What types of platforms are going to be available? Are most of the ones that we're looking at injectable? Are there other, I know there's a nasal spray one. And do we expect we'll have lifetime immunity after a series with this vaccine?
Well, a lot of questions and a lot of answer that, you know, in the realm of a bit hypothesis-driven explanation, because it's hard to really know exactly what happened. But there's things that are known in vaccinology. If you have a platform, for example, a replication competent, so a vaccine that replicates, this usually is linked more efficiently, or if you get 1 dose of those, you get usually a better immunity, long-term immunity. It mimics what the pathogen does when it infects a host. Most of the vaccine are not replication competent or are protein-based. So again, no, they don't amplify in the host or in the individual being vaccinated. And for this reason, this stimulation of the immune system is a bit shorter term and sometimes also lower in amplitude, but sometimes not. But the point with this is that this leads to vaccines that are more efficient, especially for the long term when there's 2, 3, and sometimes more doses. I think what we can expect is the vaccine that would be safe and efficacious after 1 or 2 doses, whatever is needed, may require another boost later on. But if it works short term, it may not be for more than a year or 10 years. But at one point, I think that same vaccine reasonably could be given again to continue the stimulation and recall response from vaccination. So I think that again, the vaccine we'll see early on, I think crossing those lines of safety and efficacy will have a good chance to lead to long-term protection, even if additional doses may be required. And one thing that we have not discussed that is not usually discussed much, but to my big surprise now, it's a bit more on the table, is that you can imagine if we have different vaccine, that there could be a mix-up, if you want, that some vaccine could be given and then some other vaccine could be follow-up doses. It needs to be evaluated again, and it's a lot of work again, but it opens the possibility of a strategy leading to long-term protection. Thank you.
And Brian or Marianne, did you have anything to add to that? I know it was a long, complicated question, but just around the different formulations and immunity and the concept of herd immunity, which I prefer to call it community immunity, but the herd immunity and what would it take to get there with a vaccine program? Brian, why don't you start?
Well, I'll just say that for some of the things that we've seen on television, the people collecting in karaoke bars and motorcycle rallies, herd immunity is probably appropriate, but community, we'll go with community immunity. Even in the areas that have been hit hardest, we're talking about at least 85% of the population still vulnerable. And so we've had 8 to 10 months of transmission, and we're nowhere near what might be considered a community immunity threshold for reduction of disease. I think it's certainly not my area of expertise, but many people have been quoting numbers of at least 65, 70% immunity to see real reductions from community immunity. So I really don't think that's going to be the route forward. And that does come back to some of the things Marianne was talking about, that if we have 15 or 20 or 25% of the population that says, I don't want the vaccine, we may find it very difficult to actually achieve a level of community immunity that is acceptable. And I'll just put on my scientific hat for a second. What Gary said, I think, is really important and interesting. Obviously, most companies have very little interest in combining their vaccine with somebody else's vaccine. But in fact, that may be a very appropriate strategy for dealing with this virus. We don't have the luxury of having lots of different vaccines targeting the same pathogen. And we probably will have that with COVID. We should exploit that opportunity to find out how a DNA vaccine followed by a protein vaccine or vice versa actually works. And this may change vaccinology for some of the more complicated pathogens in the world, Hep B, HIV, tuberculosis, syphilis, and so on.
So Marianne, I'll ask you to comment on that as well, and maybe comment about what do we know about mutations that are happening with COVID-19 and any implications that might have on immunity from vaccines or the attainment of community immunity.
So I think I agree with both Gary and Brian that really understanding how vaccine platforms may be able to be combined. And there's a little bit of information from things like cancer immunotherapy and somewhat in HIV vaccines that use that as an approach, that prime with one and boost with another. especially if we find out through the vaccine evaluation that this is a little bit more difficult than we anticipated. I think those will happen naturally. It's very interesting, the mutation rate of coronaviruses in general are lower than some of the viruses that are currently targeted with vaccines. It's not like flu, where it mutates and has shifts and drifts where you see a significantly different virus every year. I think there's a lot of focus being made with the mutations that have been described. And it really depends on the platform, how the individual platforms would address that. I can't imagine, I haven't seen any data to date showing that any mutation that SARS-CoV-2 has stably had in the population changing immunity, any of the vaccine candidates. I think everybody's looking at it, everybody's following it. Our platform uses very small pieces of the virus, so we can sort of get around some of the mutations. I think it really depends on the platform, how they would address that if science indicated that mutations could get around a specific vaccine. But to my knowledge, there's no data suggesting that is probable with this virus.
So I have a couple more questions, and then I'm going to end off with a prediction question to all of you. So start thinking about that now. But is there anything we can learn, particularly from Russia and China and the vaccines that are being rolled out there? And I don't know if anybody has some specific insight into that, but maybe I'll start with you, Gary.
Yeah, well, I did follow them a bit closer when in the days of Ebola, because they did license an Ebola vaccine, each one of them. Sometimes one of them for more restricted use to the military, and the other one more larger population, which never was really used in a larger population context, but still it was licensed. I think it's, on one hand, it's important to realize that some countries seem to be passing through these requirements faster. At the same time, following all the requests that I've seen to see those clinical files, investigational brochure, like I would say, none were really received and shared. So I think it remains, licensure of a vaccine is the prerogative of a country. A country decides to say yes or no. It's hard to say exactly if the requirement is it because they're different or is it because they're more efficient. But I think it's important to realize that speeds are going at different places are a bit different. Yeah, thank you.
Marianne, did you have anything to add to that question?
No, I don't think I've seen as much data. I think like any evaluation of a vaccine technology, as Gary said, it's completely under the purview of that country. But, as scientists, we really have to look at the data as it emerges. And I think as it becomes public, we'll be able to take a look at it.
One of the other questions that have come up in various different ways is around post-marketing surveillance and how will we monitor if there are serious adverse reactions once the vaccines, I say vaccines, are being used in the population. Maybe I'll ask you, Brian, to start with that, to talk about some of the challenges that we might have with serious adverse events and post-marketing surveillance.
I remember to unmute myself. Canada is very lucky. We have excellent surveillance systems for looking at serious adverse events. Both our passive and active systems are actually, I think, state of the art. We've had IMPACT, which monitors pediatric admissions, and we have the SOS system that's part of the Canadian Immunization Research Network that monitors hospitalization for adults. I think that again, the world is going to have to cooperate. It is unlikely that a population as small as Canada, even if we were to vaccinate our entire population of 36 million people, and be able to monitor everybody closely, we might not see very rare adverse events that could only be picked up by highly vaccinated populations in much larger countries. So I think that as these vaccines roll out and are given to hundreds of millions and then billions of people, it makes sense for, again, all of us to cooperate to monitor vaccine adverse events, serious adverse events around the world, to beef up the surveillance abilities in countries that might not have them, and to maintain the surveillance systems that we have in Canada at their high level.
Gary, did you have anything you want to add to the post-marketing surveillance question?
I fully agree with Brian in terms of the quality of the surveillance system. In Canada, we're very lucky for this, I think due to the structure of the healthcare system. At the same time, I think it's still important to keep a very laser focused attention to a COVID vaccine that is being released. And the reason is that as we will see, the sheer number of people being vaccinated will be extremely high in a very short period of time. It may be bringing to light some side effects that normally will not be detected, but that are important to capture. Again, to have open discussion all the time, you know, our normal acceptability to side effect is very, very low. But when you put this in the discussion, you realize that in the current days, we would not be able to get rid of smallpox because the smallpox vaccine was linked to side effects that were still much more important. So what I'm trying to say is that the key in this, again, is surveillance, and to know the data and share the data with everybody, make sure it's transparent, that the people have the information, and then have the discussion on the risk benefit of every effort. You know, there's a huge risk benefit also of not doing any vaccination and letting this virus circulate and causing all the damage and the side effect, including long-term, into the health of everybody. So all this has to be discussed, has to be in the balance. And I do believe, you know, vaccine, the one top medical intervention that will save the highest number of human lives, I think it will prevail at the end. But again, it's important to do it in full light and discussion. Thank you.
And Marianne, any further comments?
Other than I agree, I think Gary said it really succinctly, is that not getting vaccinated is as much of a choice. It is with its own risk and benefit to being vaccinated in each individual. And I think it's communicating that it's not just a choice. Do you get vaccinated now or do you get vaccinated later? Each of those is a choice, and each of those decisions has its own risks and benefits. I think that's a really, really great way to say it. And I think that's what we'll have to communicate when there's a vaccine available.
All right, and that's the perfect segue into the last question I'm going to ask each of you. Maybe I'll start with you, Marianne. What's your best guess for when a vaccine, any vaccine, will be available to be used in Canada?
Okay, so my personal opinion, based on my own I'm thinking March 2021. Maybe I'm being a little pessimistic, but that's available to anyone in Canada?
Or available at least to start our public health programs across the country.
I'd love to think it was before then, but that's sort of my completely personal opinion guess.
All right, Brian, what about you?
I'm by nature an optimist, and so I think that first quarter 2021 is the earliest. I think it's possible that Medicago will be one of those vaccines, or Medicago's vaccine will be one of those. And I think it's almost a guarantee that at least one of the vaccines that Canada has made an advance purchase agreement about will become available in about that same time frame.
All right, Gary, last word to you, and I'll turn it back to Ian.
Thank you. Listen, I put my date to spring to the summer of 2021 for the release of a vaccine, availability of a vaccine in a meaningful way at the population level. I think it's very likely we will see a release of vaccine for target population before that will already help and have a positive impact. You know, I'm certainly hoping for it. We shall see. Thank you.
All right, I want to say thank you very much to all of you. We didn't get to every question, but I think we got a lot of the key issues around vaccines, and certainly I learned a lot about the different types of vaccines that might be available. And I can reassure people that the public health side of our country is working very hard on making sure we have the facilities in place and the plans in place to administer vaccines if and when they become available. And that's something we've been focusing on from our side as well. And I hear from all of you that openness, transparency, and communication are going to be the key things for making sure that we get the right vaccines to the right people in the most timely way that we can. And that is going to be, I absolutely agree with all of you, an important part in helping us manage and getting through this pandemic, not only in Canada, but globally. So thank you very much for your wisdom today, and I'll turn it over to you, Ian.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. Thank you, Marianne, Gary, and Brian for an incredibly informative webinar. Bonnie, outstanding. You ended us exactly on time. Great, thank you. And all of you for giving up the last 75 minutes. You're all incredibly busy, so it's greatly appreciated. To everyone who's still on, I'll just remind you that this recording will be posted to CPHA's YouTube channel as soon as possible, so that'll be just later this week. And while we couldn't answer all your questions, I think that a lot of the key ones were answered. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and stay well. Goodbye.
Bye now.